Welcome to another episode of Lessons in Humanities. The title of today's lecture is Sectional Crisis. Topics will include the events that lead up into the American Civil War. Some of those events include the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, Harper's Ferry attack, and also the election of 1860. If you think that is interesting, then stick around. Before we begin today, please do me a favor, give me a thumbs up and subscribe. That really helps me out. If you're interested in the PPT or the Google Slides of this presentation, please check out my star. It is in the description below. There's also a lot of other great lesson plans and activities you might be interested in. So let's begin. So first we need to talk about slavery. Slavery, before the American Revolution, was in most places of the world, and it was accepted as natural. Of course, not everywhere, but many places around the world. And there were some events between the founding of the United States in 1776 and the beginning of the American Civil War where the United States was brought a little bit closer to abolishing slavery. Now, the American Revolution, of course, begins in the United States. And that is not going to stop slavery. All 13 colonies slavery will be legal in all 13 colonies. But there were some developments during the war. For example, 20,000 blacks fought for the British and 9,000 blacks fought for the Americans. Now, of course, the British promised them freedom if the British had won, but they did not. It should also be mentioned during the American Revolution is the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which declared the United States a new country. It was written by Thomas Jefferson, who owned up to 200 slaves at any time in his adult life. And in that document, he wanted to blame the British for slavery and the horrors of slavery. And this clause, this anti-slavery clause in the Declaration of Independence was taken out. It was suggested to be taken out. Nobody knows exactly who, but it can be speculated that it was possibly somebody who didn't want to upset or break relations with some powerful plantation owners. Now, another event or law that's going to bring the United States a little bit closer to abolishing slavery is the Northwest Ordinance. So this is in 1787, the same year as the Constitutional Convention. So this is really the beginning of the Constitution that is the framework for the United States government. In the Northwest Ordinance, now that's the territory which is like the Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan type of area. So it's the old Northwest. And it set up how the states are going to be created, or the territories are going to be created, and the school systems and the zoning and whatnot. But in the ordinance, it said no slavery. So slavery was going to be forbidden in that area. So that kind of shows that some of the founding fathers did have it in their mind to end slavery, or they wanted it to gradually become abolished, or slowly fade away. That's a lot of founding fathers thought that at the time. Now, of course, there's the French Revolution that was in 1789, about the same time. And in the French Revolution, you have the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which is a declaration of equality. And that, of course, influenced the Western world. But not much later after that, a French colony in Haiti is going to have the Haitian Revolution. That's going to be in 1803. Now, the Haitian Revolution is an uprising by slaves in Haiti, which is now known as Haiti, which was a French colony, and the slaves won. So this was the first successful revolution where the slaves took over the country. It would take a civil war to completely abolish slavery. So it's going to be another 61 years after a little under 60 years after the Haitian Revolution. Now, the big event, one of the biggest events leading up to the kind of a turning point or milestone leading up to the American Civil War is the Missouri question. So In 1803, the United States obtained Louisiana from France, from Napoleon. So that's the same year as the Haitian Revolution. And Haiti, for the French, was the most valuable territory in the Western Hemisphere because it had the sugar. Now, Louisiana was big, but it wasn't really seen to be that valuable. And they used it to ship resources or raw materials down the Mississippi River to help Haiti, which was their most valuable possession at that time. Now, of course, after they lost Haiti because of the Haitian Revolution, and also because Napoleon was busy fighting in Europe, Louisiana was sold to Jefferson and his administration, and the size of the United States doubled. Now, for years and decades, a lot of that territory is just going to be territory until enough people move there. And it's hard to get over there, Roads are not built yet. There's just some paths and whatnot, but steamboats, all this is happening in the 1800s, actually. But in the early 1800s, it was very difficult. And in the later 1800s as well, of course. But in Missouri, which is west of the Mississippi, in what was the Louisiana Territory, they had enough people, and they started to write a constitution and a local government, and they wanted to apply to be a state in the United States. And of course, they need Congress's approval for that. But this was the problem. Should it be a slave state or should it be a free state? That is the big question. So this is going to be a turning point in the sectional crisis, because this is when the discussion gets heated up. And this is when more people are talking about the slavery question. And we realize how divided the United States was at that time because of the Missouri question. So in 1819, actually, they applied for statehood. And at that time, there were 10,000 slaves or so that had arrived in Missouri with their masters. And big question is slave or free. And of course, this question is much more than about should it be slave or should it be free? I mean, there's different reasons. There's moral reasons and there's political or power reasons. So for the obvious reason, many people, there's more and more abolitionists, not too many at this time in the 1820s, but more people are arguing that slavery is an awful institution. So they're arguing that it should be abolished. So there's the moral reasons for making it a free state, but it's also about power. If it's a slave state, the South will have more power in Congress and electoral votes. If it becomes a free state, the North will have more power, because the North and South are becoming a little bit more distinct in their economies. The North being industrial, the South being more agrarian. And of course, there was farms in the North, and it's not a black and white issue, but generally speaking, they were different economically. So Tallmadge Amendment. So it's proposed by this guy named James Tallmadge. He's from the North, so one can surmise that he would be against slavery. That's not always the truth, but in this case, he proposed gradual abolition of slavery in Missouri. And this is what they were doing in the North, I should mention. So since the Constitution and the founding of the country, even before that, the North was slowly abolishing slavery, and it wasn't immediate emancipation. It was slow abolition. So some states, they would still have some slavery in different parts, or older people would still be enslaved while younger people were becoming emancipated. But that was his suggestion for Missouri, and this is going to outrage the South. So it was passed in the House of Representatives, but it failed. It failed in the Senate. So this is going to make the South angry, just the idea that they're going to try to abolish slavery. They think they're going to abolish it in the South, and it's going to destroy their livelihoods. So of course you have the Missouri Compromise. They had to make a compromise. And Missouri is going to be a slave state. Now, if you look at the map here, it's a little bit north, so it's kind of. It could have easily been a free state, but it doesn't matter, because Maine, which was part of Massachusetts, becomes a new state, and it's going to be a free state. So you have that 50-50 balance. Now, if that balance is broken, either the North or South will have more power, and that could cause a problem. Now, part of the Missouri Compromise also is that everything west of the Mississippi River will be divided along the 3630 line. So everything south of it will be a slave, and everything north of it will be free. Now, this balancing act is not going to last forever. So you can kind of see what's going to happen in the future, because there's this thing called manifest destiny, where the United States is going to move all the way to California, and it's going to continue to cause this conflict. But for a while, we have a temporary reprieve. So people, this Missouri Compromise was all over the newspapers and talked about in the taverns and newsletters, and people, it was all over the place, right? The speeches in Congress. So it was much more heated up than before, but there's a temporary solution, and people thought maybe civil war could be avoided. I mean, during the Missouri Compromise, people thought there was going to be a civil war back then. That's 40 years before the American Civil War. Even Thomas Jefferson, who was about 6 years away from dying of natural causes and old age, he thought it was a death knell to the Union. So there was a lot of fear. Shows you how tense it was. But one of the questions that was coming up during this reprieve, or even during the Missouri Compromise debates, was this question: is what does all men were created equal? What does that mean? I mean, from the Declaration of Independence, what does the Constitution mean? Does the Constitution justify or allow slavery, or does it not allow it? Now, people who are abolitionists, they're going to say it doesn't allow it. They're going to find phrases or clauses that support their point of view. And the people that are slavers are going to say it does allow it. So they're going to use the document to support their point of view. But if you read the Constitution, you will see that it doesn't actually say the word slave anywhere. And it doesn't say a race. But there is a compromise that was made during the convention. It was called the 3/5 Compromise. So there's this debate on whether blacks should be considered part of the population. And remember, if you have more population, you have more representation in the House of Representatives in Congress, and more electoral votes, so it's easier to get the president that you want. So it was decided that 3/5, for every 5 slaves, they'd be counted as 3 slaves. So it's the 3/5 Compromise, and it doesn't actually say the word slaves or blacks, but it does insinuate that it's the people in bondage, the persons held in service. And there's another clause that says Congress cannot interfere with international slave trade until 1808. Now, the people who think slavery is allowed in the Constitution are going to say, well, see, it says slavery is allowed, and it's just not the slave trade in 1808, but it doesn't say slavery is illegal. But the abolitionists are going to say, wait, that means in 1808 slavery can be abolished. So people are using the document to support their own point of view. It also has a fugitive slave clause, where if a slave runs away, the other states need to help capture the slave and bring it back to the South. Now, this is going to be a big deal in the Compromise of 1850, so we'll talk about that soon. But nonetheless, does the Constitution support or not support the slavery? That was the question. And even an abolitionist, a lot of abolitionists say, no, it doesn't support it, but there was one that said it does, and they thought it was terrible. It was William Lloyd Garrison. He was an abolitionist. He was the publisher of The Liberator, which is a anti-slavery publication. He said that it was supporting slavery and that it should be torn apart. He was anti-Constitution. Now, this balancing of act, like I said, you can't do it forever, right? And as you can just look at the map, you know what's going to happen. You look at the map the way it was in 1820 or the 1830s, and you look at it, what it looks like today, you know what's going to happen is the United States is going to go all the way to California, to the west. And the question is what's going to happen with those new states? Now, the Missouri Compromise kind of answered that, but there's going to be some conflict. So in 1836, Arkansas is admitted as a slave state, which undoes the balance for about a year until Michigan, which is a free state. So that balance is preserved. And then in 1845, the Republic of Texas, which was an independent country after fighting for its independence from Mexico, was annexed to the United States. And when it was annexed to the United States, then, that meant there was more slave states. And also Florida, which was already a territory, that was also admitted to as a state, and that was a slave state. So the balance is destroyed in 1845, and we're about 15 years away from the Civil War. Now I'm going to go into some more of these events that are going to lead to the Civil War. So the first one, of course, was Missouri Compromise. But I also want to talk about some famous people at this time. For example, Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, he escaped slavery. So he was born, his name was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. And he would change his name after he escaped so he wouldn't be caught. But he escaped slavery. He taught himself to read and write as a slave. And in fact, one of his master's wives taught him, but then the husband told her to stop doing it. So he continued to learn by himself. And he was so smart, he would go teach other boys in the neighborhood, right? He would teach other slaves in the neighborhood. And he would even learn to read and write from the street kids. But he would ultimately become a national leader of the abolitionist movement. So, he used to read The Liberator, which was, published by William Lloyd Garrison. And one day he actually met William Lloyd Garrison. And that's another name you should remember. He's a strong, religious man, a very, very powerful abolitionist at this time. So Frederick Douglass met him, and Garrison said, hey, you're a smart guy. You should travel around the country and give speeches. So that's what he did. He went around the country, he gave speeches. He also wrote a book called The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. And in 1858, he actually met John Brown, and he almost went on a little attack at Harper's Ferry, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. But another person to remember is Harriet Tubman. Now, first of all, let's talk about the Underground Railroad. So the Underground Railroad was a series of secret routes and safe houses that were used to help slaves escape in the South, or from the South, I should say. And it was estimated that about 100,000 slaves they escaped over a period. I'm not exactly sure how many years, but after a period of years, they escaped slavery and they found their freedom in the north of the United States or in Canada, which was British Canada. And one of the most famous abolitionists who was involved with this Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman. So she escaped slavery, and she would make 13 missions on the Underground Railroad to save 70 slaves in the South. Now, a lot of those slaves that she saved were her family members. So that's Harriet Tubman. So the Mexican Cession. So 1848, so this is 3 years after Texas was added to the United States, was the end of the Mexican-American War. And after that war, the Mexican Cession was given or forcefully sold to the United States. And the states that would be included in that territory included California, modern-day California, modern-day Nevada, Utah, parts of Arizona, parts of New Mexico, and parts of Colorado. So all this territory was added to the United States. This was after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican-American War. But I think you can see what the problem is. If you follow the Missouri Compromise, it should be pretty simple. Everything under the 3630 should be slave and everything north should be free, but there's going to be some conflicts. So during the Mexican-American War, when it seemed clearly that the territory was going to become Americans, there's a proposal by Congress to ban slavery in the territories gained after the Mexican-American War. So the guy name was David Wilmot. He was from Pennsylvania, and he proposed it. Wilmot was originally a Northern Democrat, and then he would become a member of the Free Soil Party, and then he helped organize the Republican Party. But this proposition would cancel the Missouri Compromise, which would make some people angry. And of course, like the Tallmadge Amendment, it passed in the House, but it failed in the Senate. So the South was not going to accept it. Now, let's talk about a few presidents. So there's going to be some presidents that are significant in this time period. So we have President Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore. So James Polk was the president during the Mexican-American War. He was an avid manifest destiny expansionist type of guy, kind of a young America type of nationalist. He was only going to be president for 4 years, and they called the Mexican-American War Mr. Polk's War. And of course, it's going to greatly increase the size of the United States. But one of the heroes in that war was Zachary Taylor. So he was a Whig, and he was also a pro-slavery president. He actually died while in office. He ate, this is a story, I don't think it's a fact, but he ate some bad milk or some cherries and got a stomach ailment, and he died. So he wasn't going to be president for very long. He's only, in fact, the first Whig president, William Henry Harrison, also died in office 31 days into office. So the Whigs had a lot of bad luck. But we have another Whig, it's Zachary Taylor, and he will be replaced by his vice president, Millard Fillmore, who is also a Whig. And what's a little bit ironic is Taylor was a pro-slavery president. In fact, he was the last president to own a slave while being president. Now, the last president to own a slave, but not while in the White House, was actually Ulysses S. Grant, who was a Republican, He owned one when he was younger, but then he became anti-slavery later. But Zachary Taylor actually owned one while living in the White House, and he would be the last president to do so. But Millard Fillmore was more of he was anti-slavery. He didn't believe in slavery. Now, this is going to be significant because they're both going to have to deal with the Compromise of 1850. Now, remember where we are. We're right after the Mexican-American War, and we have the Mexican Secession. So you have all that territory. So we have a pro-slavery president and then an anti-slavery president. So they need to do a compromise, kind of like in 1820, the Missouri Compromise. But this is going to be called the Compromise of 1850. And what is strange is that the Compromise of 1850 is generally considered to be more pro-slavery. At least the North thinks that. And it's a compromise to try to help to make everybody in the South and the North happy about what to do with these new territories and what to do with the slave question. But ironically, Zachary Taylor was against it. There's a lot in it he didn't like, and then he died. And then Millard Fillmore, who was anti-slavery, supported what is considered more of a pro-slavery compromise. But nonetheless, it's just what happened in Missouri. They had to decide what to do with this new territory. Should they be slave states or free states or territories? Slave territory or free territory. And how is that going to affect the balance of power and also the moral issue, obviously. And they couldn't make any agreements, so they actually made 5 agreements, 5 different deals, right? And the Great Compromise, Henry Clay was involved in this, actually, but he got sick and he couldn't end it. So he was replaced by Stephen Douglass, a senator from Illinois, a Democrat. But the final decision was California was going to be a free state, and Texas was going to lose some boundary with New Mexico. D.C. was going to be, where slavery was legal, the slave trade was going to be abolished, but not slavery. Now, let me talk about that for a second. That is fascinating because imagine the United States, which is bragging about all men are created equal and liberty and freedom. And let's say you're from Britain, or you're from France, or you're from Mexico, or you're from any country in South America or from Europe that visits D.C., Washington, D.C., the capital, and they see slaves being traded in auctions on the streets. It is a bad picture, a bad image for the United States. So slavery will continue in Washington, D.C., but the slave trade, the internal, not the international, that's already abolished, but the internal trade, interstate trade, will be abolished. Now, the other thing is the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, I already said back during the Constitution from 1787, there was already a Slave Act in there, but it wasn't that strong. And there's some more that will come and go over the 80 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. But there's going to be a new one, a Fugitive Slave Act, which is going to be stricter. And this is going to be strict where, for example, if you're in the North and you don't report a slave, you could be punished, right? So they make it much more strict. And this is going to be the most controversial one. And then Utah and New Mexico territory will be popular sovereignty. So that means they can choose. That's what popular sovereignty means, is they can choose. Now, the most controversial of them all is the Fugitive Slave Act. Some people called it the Bloodhound Bill. So Northern blacks, they feared that they would be kidnapped and forced into slavery, and that would happen at times. And then the Northerners also were worried that they'd get in trouble if they didn't turn in a runaway slave. There's another actually terrible thing, is local officials, they were paid $10 for turning in a runaway slave. But if they reported a black who was not a runaway, they'd only get $5. So that gave some officials in certain areas incentive to turn in a runaway slave. So in reality, not many people turned in runaway slaves, but it made the North very angry. And a lot of blacks in the North, they actually would go to British Canada because they feared that they would be captured and sent down to the South. And it should be mentioned that if a runaway slave was captured, they were not given the jury by duty, which American citizens were allowed to have. They just went to an official. It's called a bench trial, and a judge would just say if they were guilty or not. So they couldn't really defend themselves. There's also something called the personal liberty laws, and this happened over a period of time. But Northerners were arguing for states' rights. So there was these personal liberty laws where they wanted to guarantee anyone accused of being a fugitive slave a jury trial. So these were like local laws that were kind of going against the federal law. And they argued states' rights. And what's interesting about that is the South is going to argue that the Civil War is about states' rights. But the North were arguing about that too, but just a different right. They actually forbade state officials from aiding federal authorities. So this was like a de facto nullification, kind of like the nullification crisis during Andrew Jackson's period. So they weren't following the federal law. So yeah, I wrote that at the bottom. In essence, it nullified the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, another big event that happened that would lead to the American Civil War is the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was in 1852, so we're only 9 years away from the war. Written by Harriet Beecher, who grew up in Connecticut and moved somewhere in Ohio area, not too far from Kentucky, where she saw some runaway slaves. But this was a book about what was happening in the South. I mean, it was a novel. It wasn't a true story, but this story sold many, many copies. So it was a best-selling novel of the 18th century. It was the second best book, only behind the Bible of the 19th century. But people were reading about it. People were talking about it. So you see these events, more and more people are aware. So, I mean, imagine, maybe somebody from the North, far away from the South, and they are young and they never even seen slavery. But they hear about it, and, what do they hear? Maybe not too much, but with this book and everybody's talking about it, the awareness and the horror of slavery would come alive to people in the North. So this increased many, many more abolitionists. More and more people are passionate, and more people are willing to change, to make slavery abolished in the South. But this would help lead to the Civil War. And there's a story that Abraham Lincoln, who would meet Harriet Beecher Stowe, once said, "So this is the little lady who started this great war." Now, some argue that was never said, but that's the story. Maybe it was said, maybe it wasn't. Now let's talk a little bit about political parties. Now, of course, as you know, the first two political party system in the United States were the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. So George Washington, who was really no party, but he's kind of a Federalist, plus John Adams, and then Democratic Republicans, the Thomas Jeffersons. James Madison was also a Democratic Republican. But when we got to Andrew Jackson, well, by then the Federalists were already gone. They made a mistake during the War of 1812, but they were gone by then. There's only the Democratic Republicans. But then you have Andrew Jackson, who was so controversial, so divisive, that the people that hated Jackson, they joined the Whigs, a new party called the Whigs. And then the other party is called the Democrats, and that's the Democrats of today. Now, the Whigs were mostly anti-slavery, but it was not the most important issue to them. They were worried about internal improvements, having a national bank, protective tariffs. So it wasn't their number one issue. And leading up to the Civil War, the Democrats, they would be split between the North and the South over the issues of slavery. But there's another party, it's called the Free Soil Party. Now, this came from the Liberty Party, which was an abolitionist party, which started back in 1839. And they were disgusted with the Whigs because they didn't do enough about trying to stop slavery. But the Liberty Party would turn into what is the Free Soil Party, which was not an abolitionist party. It was a little bit different than the Liberty Party. They just were anti-slavery, and they didn't want slavery to spread. So they weren't trying to abolish it in the South. They just didn't want it to spread to the new territories. And a lot of the Free Soil Party's members would start the Republican Party, and that's the party of Abraham Lincoln, and that's when the war is going to begin. Now, we'll talk about some elections because it's going to be very significant leading up into the war. So you have the election of 1852, 56, and of course 60. That is what sparks off the war. So let's talk a little bit about these. So in 1852, we have Franklin Pierce, a Democrat. We also have Winfield Scott, a Whig, and this is when the Whigs die. The Whigs, not because of Scott, but because they are going to fade away. They're going to become divided over the slavery issue. So this will be it for them. They'll be around for a little bit longer, but this will be their last big chance. And then, of course, we have John Hale. It's a Free Soil Party. So you see that the abolitionists, right? They're not abolitionists, but their anti-slavery party is gaining traction. And the United States is going to get Franklin Pierce in 1852. And he was a Northern Democrat, and they called him a doughface. And what's a doughface? People in the North that supported the Southern way of life, or were pro-slavery, or had sympathy for the South. In the North, at that time they called them doughfaces, and I don't know exactly why, but he was a doughface. And considered by, now this is not, this is more of an opinion, a historian's opinion, but many considered him to be one of the worst presidents in American history. He actually met a lot of tragedy in his life. He lost a kid, when he was on a train from Connecticut going, I'm not exactly sure, maybe to New York. On the train, it derailed, and he saw his kid die right in front of him. That's while he was president. So he did come across a lot of tragedy while he was alive, and he was just considered. He didn't do anything, and he didn't make anything better, and he drank too much. In fact, after the next election, he's like, well, I might as well just go drink, because that was it. He was done. He was going to be out of the White House. But he was a doughface. He's going to be president when there is something called the KansasNebraska Act. So this is in 1854. So just look at the dates. Remember, 1861 is the American Civil War. So you remember that territory, that Louisiana territory, where Missouri was? Well, there's still all that territory that goes all the way up to what is Canada, and lots of territory right there. So it was really unorganized. So Illinois Senator Stephen Douglass, right? This is going to be an important senator at the time, who believed in popular sovereignty, which means that, well, he was more pro-slavery, but he's like, okay, the states, they can choose, right? Not the federal government, but the states. They can do a popular vote within the state and decide if they want to have slavery or not. But it was drafted by him, and The reason he did it was he wanted a new transcontinental railroad to go through Chicago, so he had incentive to organize this territory. And he decided we'll have Kansas and Nebraska, two of the territories. And he said that it would be popular sovereignty, so the territories could choose if it was a slave or a free territories. Now, states or territories above the 3630 line could vote to have slavery. That means the Missouri Compromise is done, right? So that's going to infuriate the North. And the North at this time are really feeling that the government is against them. It's more a pro-slavery government. And this is going to lead to violence in Kansas. Now, Nebraska, they're going to vote to be a free state, and that's a bigger territory. But Kansas is right near Missouri. It's on the edge. There's people from the north going into Kansas. There's people from the south bringing slaves to Kansas, and they're trying to influence whether it would be a slave or free state. So that leads to Bleeding Kansas. And this is a period of right up to the American Civil War. But this is a result of the KansasNebraska Act. Now, this was a tragic prelude, which is the name of this painting of John Brown here, to the American Civil War. So there was electoral fraud, there was raids, assaults, and murders in Kansas territory. Some people really consider this the beginning of the American Civil War. But it was the conflict over whether Kansas would be a slave state or a free state. And remember, you got these northern free staters, as they were called, coming in, bringing guns, right? They're bringing these Beecher Bibles, which were another word for a gun, after Harriet Beecher, Stowe, the writer of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And there was these people called the Border Ruffians, which was a southern pro-slavery faction that was going into Kansas. And there'd be blood. And, for example, there was this one city, it was called Lawrence, and some pro-slavers, border ruffian type of people would go in there, and they attacked, they attacked Lawrence and they took it over. So what happened after that? There's this guy named John Brown. It's the guy in this picture with the long beard. He, with some of his sons and other people, they went into Lawrence and they attacked these pro-slavers and they killed 5 of them. So that was one of the more famous events that happened in what's called Bleeding Kansas. But just picture Kansas in a mini civil war with deaths and murders and attacks. And of course, John Brown, who we will see again. But in this state, in Kansas, you have the two factions, and you have, you're gonna have two conflicting constitutions. They're gonna write their own constitutions. So in effect, you have like two governments in Kansas, neither one that's being accepted by Congress. So you have a pro-slavery constitution for Lecompton area of Kansas, and you have an anti-slavery constitution from Topeka. So there's two governments, but Congress wouldn't approve either of them, so they couldn't make up their decisions. And all the elections were fraud anyways. You couldn't trust them. Now, at the very same time, during Bleeding Kansas, when all this was happening, there's something called Bleeding Sumner. And basically, Senator Charles Sumner, he's from Massachusetts, he was violently beaten by Representative Preston Brooks from South Carolina. So this was happening in the Capitol. Sumner, he gave a speech which was denouncing Kansas, right? And remember, he's a northerner. And during this speech, he said that Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina supported slavery so he could have sex with his slaves. Now, you have to remember, there was this chivalry expected in the Congress, where this was very unheard of, this type of speech. So this was something different, and he actually had that speech published and sent in the paper. So Preston Brooks, who was the cousin of Andrew Butler, who he was defaming, he was going to actually challenge Sumner to a duel, but instead he attacked him with his cane, and it seems like not a big deal, but he almost killed him. So just imagine in Congress, one senator from one state and another senator from another state being attacked and almost dying, right? So it was quite tense, and that's just another representation of what was happening. So this is in the mid 1850s, and Preston Brooks later on he was given a cane by other people in the South, and on the cane it said, hit him again, right? So he became a little bit of a martyr to the Southerners. Now we have the Republican Party. So I was talking about the different political parties, and the Republicans and the Democrats that you see today in the United States. This is where we get the Republicans, the GOP, the Grand Old Party. So they started in 1854. Now the Whigs, they would be split up over the KansasNebraska Act and just over the end, the idea of slavery. So they're gone. They're going to be gone, and now it's just going to be it's going to become the Republicans and the Democrats plus the third parties. But a lot of Free Soil Party, Northern Whigs, and some Northern Democrats, they are going to join the Republican Party. So they're going to advocate. They're going to advocate for free soil, so stop the spread of slavery. But it wasn't abolition. So they weren't like the Liberty Party. It wasn't abolish slavery. It was just about stopping the spread of slavery. Now the election of '56. So we have James Buchanan, who's a Democrat, versus John C. Fremont, who's the first Republican. So this is a chance for the Republicans to win. And then you have Millard Fillmore. So if you remember him, the Whig, he's now a part of the Know Nothing Party. Which the Know Nothing Party was the the anti-immigration party, the American Party. And Buchanan is going to win. And this is going to be a disappointment for Fremont and for the Republicans because they didn't win. But it shows they have a chance. And in 4 years, the Republicans are going to win. But if you look at the map here, Fremont, he wins the northern states and none in the South. And Buchanan wins the South and California and a few northern ones. An interesting note about Buchanan, he's going to be the only president that was never married, the only bachelor in the White House. And his legacy is going to be determined by the Dred Scott case. So Dred Scott, he was a slave from Missouri, and he sued for his freedom because he actually lived in the North for a short time. So his owner brought him to like the Wisconsin, Minnesota area as a slave, and he continued to be a slave. And when he got back to the South or Missouri, or he might have went to another state, I'm not exactly sure. I believe it was Missouri. Somebody suggested to him that he should sue for his freedom, that he lived in the North and he was technically free. So he sued. And the Supreme Court ruled that blacks were not Americans. They were not American citizens, and they could not sue. So this was Chief Justice Taney, and he actually talked to President Buchanan. Buchanan wanted this just to be over with. Basically, yeah, so this was a big blow to the North and a big victory for the South. And it really ruled that the Missouri Compromise, Taney ruled that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. So this infuriated the North, and it really heated up the abolitionist movement. So even though they're angry, these events are making more and more abolitionists and more people angry in the North. And of course, the United States is one step closer to a civil war. Now, another event that's worthy from this time period are the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Now, Douglas, we've seen him around for a while. He was involved with, he's a senator from Illinois, a Democrat, and he was involved with the Compromise of 1850. He was also involved with the KansasNebraska Act, which led to the Kansas bleeding and murder and chaos in Kansas. And he was a popular sovereignty guy. He wanted the states to decide. So he was really pro-slavery. But he's like, it's up to the states to decide if they were going to be slave or free. So he is a challenger. And that challenger is the relatively young Abraham Lincoln. And he's a Republican. And one of the major topics, it was 7 debates that went around Illinois. One of the debates was the future of slavery. And that was a big issue, so a lot of people listened to it. And in fact, these debates were really popular, and Lincoln would print them, have them published, and use that to promote his campaign in 2 years later in the presidential campaign. But this made Lincoln a national figure. And actually, Stephen Douglas is going to win the race. He's going to win the senatorial race. Lincoln is going to lose. But only 2 years later, Lincoln is going to defeat Douglas in the presidential race. Now, there's one important speech. Now, this is actually not part of the debates, but it's before the debates that Lincoln gave. It's called the House Divided speech. And so before debating Douglas for the senatorial race, Abraham Lincoln gave this House Divided speech, which became very, very famous, and he also printed it, before he became president as well. So it says, in my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. So this is an important speech, which is just saying that, this 50-50, like the Missouri Compromise or this Compromise of 1850, all these different compromises just cannot continue. That the United States had to be all slave or all free. And he's a Republican, which is the anti-slavery expansionist party. So people could understand where he stood when he became the president 2 years later. Now there's going to be another event that is going to be significant, and it's with our old friend John Brown. So remember John Brown? He was in the Bleeding Kansas when he attacked Lawrence, the slave traders there, and killed 5 of them. John Brown, this is a very religious man with many children, and he was a very radical abolitionist and a hero to the abolitionist movement back then, a hero to the North. But he assembled a team to attack a weapons arsenal in Virginia, what is today West Virginia. He actually asked Frederick Douglass to join him, but Douglass refused. And Harriet Tubman actually helped him recruit some people for this mission. But the goal was to start a slave rebellion, a slave revolt, a war in the South. Now you have to understand, at this time the South was terrified of a slave revolt. I mean, ever since 1803 with Haiti, the Haitian Revolution, there was also the Denmark-Vesey plot. 1700s, the Stoner Rebellion, there's a New York uprising. I mean, there have been many different slave attempts at rebellions before, and that was a big fear in the South at this time. And he was trying to make it happen. He was trying to get some weapons, and he was trying to give it to slaves, and they would fight. They would fight and set themselves free. That was his goal. But this attack was thwarted. It was stopped, and John Brown would actually be executed. And if you look in this picture, this was painted many years after, but it's John Brown being sent to his death, his execution. But when when his attack was crushed, the leader of the local militia was Robert E. Lee. He's of course the Confederate leader during the Civil War. Brown would be a hero to the North, but Brown would be a traitor to the South. What else do I want to say here? But this is bringing the United States really, really closer to war. It's right there. It's right on the next step is civil war. And a lot of people say John Brown started the Civil War. I mean, he was very significant in Bleeding Kansas, and that was part of the Civil War. Some people think that's where the fighting really began. And then Harper's Ferry, because that's one of the last straws that's going to lead to a war, which is only about a year from this time period. But it's going to be the election of 1860, which is going to start the war. So we have Abraham Lincoln. He's a Republican. He's going to go against Stephen Douglas, his old enemy in Illinois, who was a Democrat. And you're going to have a Southern Democrat. His name is John Breckinridge. Because remember, the North and Southern Democrats are disagreeing with everything, being that it was close to a war and the country was divided. You have another one named John Bell, is Constitutional Bell. He's a constitutionalist, and he didn't want there to be a war. That was part of the Constitutional Bell. It's another third party at that time. But Lincoln, when he campaigned, he said he wasn't going to abolish slavery. Now, if that's what he really meant, or if that's really what he wanted, I'm not going to say that for sure. But I believe he probably did not want to start a civil war. So he said he's not going to abolish slavery, but he doesn't want it to expand anymore. Now, people are looking at his House Divided speech. They're looking at the Republican Party, which is considered the anti-slavery party. So I don't think the South is buying it. But the Republicans had other issues too, like the Transcontinental Railroad and how they should develop public schools. But Abraham Lincoln would actually win. He had 40% of the popular votes, but he had 0 electoral votes in the South. So if you look at the map there, he won nothing in the South. In some states, they didn't even put him on the ballot. So he didn't have a chance. The South was just terrified that he would end slavery. And and if you know what's going to happen, that is what's going to happen. He wasn't planning to at the beginning. He wasn't going to try to abolish it, but there's going to be a civil war. So we have Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States, and two of the most significant presidents in American history would include George Washington, who was imperfect but a great military leader and a very strong leader, a strong president that helped found the country, and had these great ideals along with the other founding fathers of freedom and liberty. And of course, that wasn't fulfilled in the early part of the United States. But with Abraham Lincoln, 16th president, it's a little bit closer to fulfilling that, because this is going to end slavery. But he's going to be elected in South Carolina. He's going to vote to succeed the Union. And there's going to be state after state that's going to leave the Union. And there's going to be a new country. It's called the Confederate States of the United States. So the first one is South Carolina. They have a convention, they vote, and they decide to leave. And then there's going to be 7 states that leave originally. And that's how that, and this is all happening when Buchanan is still president. So Abraham Lincoln is not even in office yet. So he's going to be in office, and he knows he's going to have a difficult job. And of course, eventually there's going to be shots fired. So I'm going to talk about this in detail in my next lesson. So please stay tuned for next week. I'm going to talk only about the actual Civil War. But here is Sumter, Fort Sumter. So this was a federal building or base, which was in South Carolina, which was now a new country, the Confederate States of the United States. And there were Union troops in there. And, the federal government said that belonged to them, right? It didn't belong to this new country, the Confederate States of the United States. So there was some controversy about that. But there were people in this base, and Lincoln sent some troops to supply them. But it wasn't really weapons. It was food and other living supplies. And shots would be fired, and there would be a civil war. So, again, next week, please stay tuned. I'm going to have a lesson about the Civil War. I just want to go over the presidents real quick that were significant in this lesson, at least. And the first one there is Zachary Taylor. So he was the hero of the Mexican-American War. And the second one is Millard Fillmore. So put those two together, because Zachary Taylor is going to die about a year and some months into his presidency and be replaced by Fillmore. And they're going to be the presidents during the Compromise of 1850. It'll be Fillmore that agrees to help it pass. And then, of course, the quote-unquote worst president in American history. I shouldn't say quote-unquote. That's just an opinion, but some people will argue that. It was Franklin Pierce, and he will be the president during the Kansas Bleeding. And then the next one is Buchanan, James Buchanan, the Bachelor. And he was also a little bit more pro-slavery, and he also wanted he's known for the Dred Scott case. And he's also known for not doing anything when all the states were seceding from the Union, when the next guy, Abraham Lincoln, was elected in 1860. And the Civil War begins. So thank you for watching. Please stay tuned for next week, and please hit that thumbs up button and subscribe, and send this video to your friends or your teachers, and please check out my store below. Good day.